Iggy Pop is typically the first person who springs to mind when someone mentions the Stooges, a band that is frequently credited with being the birthplace of punk music. Screaming in a sea of bodies, raw and wild, as though attempting to eat the entire earth. Another man, however, was stepping back from the spotlight without shouting or singing. Ron Asketon, simply leaning over his guitar and letting it do the talking. He was never a rock star like the others. No tabloid scandals, no drug-fueled antics, and no public battles for justice. Ron Asketon subtly created riffs that were straightforward yet eerie, sounds that screamed, hefty, and primal, and he permanently altered the landscape of modern music. Nevertheless, his own band ignored him, and he was forgotten for 30 years, and died unseen, alone, in an empty house. What took place? Why did rock history omit the man who established the genre's very foundation? And why do younger generations continue to refer to him as the genius of the silent riff? This is more than simply a guitarist's tale. It's the low, ringing bell of a punk legend who never needed a platform and a soul that never gave up. And the final reverberation of a guy who never sought permission to be alive. Ron Asheton was his name, and it could be time for you to hear it if you haven't already. Childhood. Born on July 17, 1948, in Washington, D.C., Ron Asheton came from a military family. Ronald F. Asheton Sr., his father, served in the United States as a lieutenant colonel. After World War II, he served in the Army at several stations in the U.S. and Europe. His mother, Eleanor Dorsey, was a kind Irish-American housewife who kept the family in order and discipline despite their frequent moves. Ron's early years were characterized by frequent travels from one state to another. Ron and his younger brother, Scott Asheton, grew up in temporary Army quarters because their father was deployed, and they never developed enduring connections or understood what home was. Ron, a quiet youngster who was perceptive and had a stare far more melancholy than his years, became inwardly focused as a result of the continual movement. Nobody was around long enough to be considered close, and there was nowhere to call home. Ron learned to befriend himself early on, and he felt genuinely alive in that lonely environment because of two things: war and rock music. At the age of 10, he fell in love with the guitar and began playing basic surf rock and blues riffs before progressively developing his own sound. He also acquired an odd fixation with military themes, which makes sense given that he was raised under the watchful eye of a father in uniform and in a position of authority. As part of his persona, he donned army jackets frequently, studied war tactics, drew maps of the battlefield in pencil, and collected vintage military equipment. After his father retired, the family finally made Ann Arbor, Michigan, their home. There, in addition to World War history literature, Ron started to broaden his horizons by acquiring electric guitars, amplifiers, the Rolling Stones, the Who, the Yardbirds, and the growling sound of British rock. He also met the people who would transform his life at Ann Arbor. Young males Dave Alexander and James Osterberg, who would later become Iggy Pop, shared Ron's restless dissatisfaction with the neat and orderly society. Ron Asketon is credited with helping to create the most rebellious sound in modern music history. No one could have guessed that the child who had drifted silently across half of the United States, bearing invisible scars from loneliness and military discipline, would do so. With a heart that never learned to ask for permission, an early career, and calloused hands clutching a guitar. In the late 1960s, Ann Arbor served as a refuge for young people fleeing the oppressive atmosphere of post-war America. There, rock music was about turmoil, wrath, and the desire to break down all barriers rather than about sounding pleasant. There, Ron Asketon, his younger brother Scott Asketon, who played drums, his close buddy Dave Alexander, who played bass, and James Osterberg, a former drummer who was dying to get behind the mic, formed a band. They couldn't think of a name for it. All they knew was that it sounded unlike anything they had ever heard. They decided on the moniker The Stooges, which was unpolished, straightforward, and even purposefully foolish. While Iggy Pop and James Osterberg writhed in quest of a performing style, rolling in blood and chewing glass on the floor, Ron Asheton had the band's creative soul from the start. He stood silently behind his Gibson Les Paul guitar, creating repeated, mesmerizing riffs. His sound radiated tension, death, and riot. It was hammer-heavy, steeped in distortion, and neither ostentatious nor beautiful. The song 1969, which had Ron's trademark riff that sounded like an engine revving on a hot summer night, launched their debut album, The Stooges, 1969, which was produced by John Cale, a former member of the Velvet Underground. I Wanna Be Your Dog, the song's centerpiece, was composed of simply 3 repeated sounds and sent the listener into a near-primal rage. Ron Asheton created a new guitar language in less than 3 minutes that was harsh, unpolished, and blatantly at odds with the musical norms of the day. The band's deeper fall into disarray, Funhouse, 1970, was released the following year. This time, Steve McKay's frantic saxophone joined Ron in driving the sound. The Stooges had stopped performing songs by that point. A Dionysian ceremonial of roaring drums, savage cries, and unrelenting fevered guitar was what they were performing. Many people were unaware that the Stooges, particularly Ron, were quite disciplined during rehearsal, in contrast to their chaotic public persona. He directed the band's overall musical direction, created the song frameworks, and managed the harmonics. The Stooges might have been just another fleeting shock act without Ron. Although no one had heard of punk rock at the time, Ron and they became the first authentic voices of what would eventually be known as punk rock. After each extravagant performance, record labels retreated, and the public labeled them maniacs. The band fell into a crisis following 2 albums that were not well received by the public. And it wasn't the outside world that dealt the most blow. The man who used to stand next to Ron on stage said it. Because Ron Asheton would be forced out of the very position he had helped build when Iggy Pop brought in a replacement guitarist for their next recording session. Career upheaval for Ron Asheton. The Stooges were more than just a group. That was all he had faith in. He stuck to his commitment to straightforward, repeated riffs that pierced the listener's mind like unsaid wrath, even while the world whirled in acid rock, prog, and funk in the early 1970s. Ron's music lacked sophisticated song structures and was not market-driven. It served as the Stooges' foundation and was unadulterated, vibrant, and genuine. Therefore, it was a sharp blow to Ron's music when Iggy Pop abruptly suggested that James Williamson take the main guitar role on their upcoming album, Raw Power, 1973. There was no explanation, no band meeting. Under David Bowie's direction and influence, Iggy desired a sound that was more glam-infused, hard rock, quicker, and sharper. And Williamson emerged as the favorite because to his forceful stabbing riffs. The band's original sound was characterized by Ron Asheton, who was subtly relegated to bass. Was he injured? Indeed. Startled? Of course. Ron, however, responded with quiet. He didn't argue. He didn't give up. He didn't rebel. Rather, he grabbed a Fender Precision bass, took a step back, and continued to play as though nothing had changed. Those who knew him saw a change. Ron became more reserved, quieter, and colder. Not only was it painful to be replaced, but it was being done inside the exact thing he had assisted in creating. Raw Power was a daring and controversial album. James Williamson blew up. On recording, Iggy Pop was an absolute disaster. However, Ron didn't recognize these stooges. He was merely a background, a shadow, in this alien transformation, and he was no longer able to identify with it. Raw Power was not even understood by the general populace. The mixes of Iggy's and Bowie's versions were mixed by Columbia Records, which contributed to an odd, lopsided sound and low sales. The situation worsened while on tour. Scott, his younger brother, fell into despair behind the drums. Ron grew more aloof. Williamson fought with promoters, and Iggy was heavily addicted to heroin. The Stooges were formally dissolved. There was no last performance, no press announcement, and no dramatic split. They just ceased to appear. The people who had once shook the rock foundations disappeared, dispersed, as though they had never been. It was the start of Iggy Pop's illustrious and tumultuous solo career. It gave James Williamson access to production employment. However, it was a silent exodus from the musical landscape for Ron Asheton, the guitarist who created the primordial punk sound with his bare hands. No magazine wanted interviews, no label called, and no one asked him to go on tour. Ron Asheton went from being a pioneer to a relic, an outcast, and the forgotten one. He lived on the periphery of rock and roll history for almost 30 years. No grudges, no resentment. The sound of a guitar and a man who had dedicated his life to music, only to have history turn its back without saying goodbye, was all that was heard. No blame. The years that were forgotten. Ron Asheton went through what he would later describe as a dark stretch when the Stooges broke up in 1974. No label, no band, no invites to perform. While James Williamson moved into music production and Iggy Pop gained popularity with David Bowie's help, Ron appeared to disappear from the rock and roll zeitgeist. There were no headlines or scandals, just an almost 3-decade period of silence. However, that quiet did not imply capitulation. After returning to Michigan, Ron continued to perform, not in stadiums, but in experimental performances, small clubs, and damp garages. He became a member of the art rock group Destroy All Monsters in 1977, which combined visual performance, noise, and punk. The band, which included avant-garde and underground musicians from the Detroit scene, was seen as strange even by punk standards. Even though Destroy All Monsters was never a monetary success, it gave Ron the opportunity to continue making music in a world where sound that followed instinct was more important than celebrity. Later on, he became a member of New Order, distinct band that had nothing to do with the British group, as well as gritty, carnival-style lo-fi rock bands that were influenced by the harsh textures of Detroit. However, none of these endeavors helped Ron regain his place in the popular music landscape. The musicians he formerly influenced were unaware of his whereabouts, and there was no hoopla or media attention. Ron started playing small parts in B-grade horror movies to earn money. He was frequently chosen to play mercenaries, monsters, or the first person killed. He gained popularity among low-budget filmmakers due to his tall stature, steely eyes, and menacing demeanor. He starred in films such as Legion of the Night, Frostbiter, 1996, and Mosquito, 1995. Ron wasn't a huge star in those movies, but like the Stooges on stage, he had a calm, unwavering power. Stoic, tough, and unexplainable. Ron Asheton's name was mainly missing from interviews, articles, or tribute collections during the 1980s and 1990s, when punk was exploding all over the world and artists like Kurt Cobain, Sonic Youth, and Jack White were regularly credited with being influenced by the Stooges. Ron, who never chased attention, was all too easy to ignore, and Iggy Pop's shadow grew too huge. Someone once asked him if he ever wished he had Iggy's level of fame during a brief discussion in Michigan. Ron merely grinned and answered, "No, that sound was made by me. That's sufficient." Ron Asheton lived like Way for almost 30 years, quietly, without complaining, without giving up, still playing, still holding a guitar, still embodying the core of his identity from the start. The lights were never necessary for him. All he needed was a guitar and an amplifier to inform everyone that he was still alive and not silent. He was unaware, however, that the door would soon open once more, and this time, his name would be called. Unfortunately, it would close permanently shortly after. In the late 1990s, something Ron Asheton never anticipated started to happen: a late revival. Younger musicians began publicly referring to him as an idol, ranging from grunge to alternative, garage revival to indie rock. Queens of the Stone Age, Jack White, Sonic Youth, and Nirvana all made their declarations simultaneously. Without Ron Asheton and the Stooges, their music would not exist. Many were shocked to discover that the man who founded punk rock in 1969 was still alive when the media dug into Detroit rock's unvarnished history. Still playing music, still residing in Ann Arbor, and yet not receiving an invitation to return to a major stage. After over 30 years of silence, the Stooges didn't get back together until 2003. Mike Watt, a longtime Minutemen bassist and Ron's biggest admirer, made the surprising idea to play on Iggy Pop's solo album, Skull Ring. Watt suggested that the Asheton brothers be brought back. Iggy agreed after hesitating. The unimaginable occurred when they took the Coachella stage in 2003. For the first time in decades, Ron Asheton grinned as he stood there holding his beloved Gibson Les Paul. It wasn't a rock star's cocky smile. It was the smile of relief from a man who had been forgotten but was now recalled. He was right where he had always been. Over the course of several years, the Stooges' reunion tour received overwhelmingly positive reviews. The crazy band that was rejected in the 1970s was no longer them. They were now adored by a new generation of punk rock elders, living legends. And instead of standing behind someone, Ron took center stage this time. The Weirdness, the Stooges' first studio album in 34 years, was released in 2007. Although Ron's appearance was a living declaration, critics were split. He was more than a relic. He was still full of energy, ideas, and things to say. It was only at that point that fans realized who had lighted the initial match, something they had forgotten for years. Ron Asheton was the one who started the fire, even though Iggy Pop may have been the explosion. He had now come back to take his rightful legacy, but destiny had other ideas. He started to appear less regularly, just as his career was taking a new turn and the tours were still selling out. According to his friends, he was worn out and frequently complained of chest symptoms, but he consistently refused to visit a doctor. Ron Asheton was discovered deceased in his Ann Arbor residence on January 6, 2009. He was thought to have died a few days ago. Heart failure was the cause of death. He passed away by himself. No audience, no spotlight, and not even a guitar to bid him farewell. The music industry was rocked by the unexpected loss. Devastated, Iggy Pop declared in public that it was the most agonizing loss of his life. Artists that held Ron in high regard spoke up. He was one of the guitarists who helped to define the 20th century's sound, according to Jack White. According to Sonic Youth's Thurston Moore, punk would not have developed without Ron Asheton. The Stooges should have received their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame decades earlier, but it didn't happen until 2010. When his name was called during the ceremony, the crowd froze, then erupted in cheers, honoring the man who invented a whole new vocabulary for guitar rock, even though Ron wasn't present to take it, never expecting anything in exchange. Every note left a mark on the listener's soul, but Ron Asheton lived his life as he played, unpretentious, unrefined, and unrepentant. Perhaps that was just how he wished to be remembered. Death and remorse. The Ann Arbor police received an odd call on January 6, 2009. It had been days since Ron Asheton's friend had been able to get in touch with him. When the door to his house was eventually opened, Ron was discovered dead, sitting in a chair, with the TV and light in the living room still on, as though he had only been outside a short while before. In actuality, however, no one had been aware that he had passed away days earlier. Sudden heart failure was identified as the cause. No overdose, no drugs, no indications of struggle. Only the heart of a man who had come out of over 30 years of darkness touched the light once more before silently ceasing. Similar to his life. In addition to being unexpected, Ron Asheton's passing shocked the music industry because it happened just as the world was starting to accept his return. The Stooges were working on their new album after completing a successful European tour. Ron was finally in the spotlight after being excluded for almost 30 years. Presented by name, applauded by large crowds, and praised in a way he had never experienced before. After that, he vanished. By themselves. His co-founder, Iggy Pop, who had once driven Ron away, was almost destroyed in the ancient Michigan home where he had once crafted riffs that would transform the world. Iggy stated in a subsequent interview, "I always thought I'd go before Ron. I always thought I was the reckless one. But it was the quiet one who left first, and I never got to say thank you the way I should have." Mike Watt, Steve McKay, and many artists from the punk, alternative, and garage scenes gathered for a special memorial at the Michigan Theater, where Ron had played the earliest Stooges tracks. There were no grand speeches, no flashy videos, just a single guitar placed at center stage, and a silence so heavy it crushed the room, just like the music he had once created. In 2010, the Stooges were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, an honor that should have come decades earlier. But when Ron Asheton's name was read aloud, the entire room rose to its feet. No one clapped right away. They stood in silence, honoring a man who had spent his life screaming through a guitar, only to leave without a word. In his acceptance speech, Iggy Pop choked back emotion. Ron never wanted to be a star, but he was the center, the first sound, the man who staked his whole career on 3 repeating notes and made the whole world listen. They called him a legend, an icon, a founding father of punk. But true fans know something even deeper. Ron Asheton was the embodiment of an art that never needed to shout because it already echoed loud enough. A silent genius, a ghost no one noticed until it vanished. Legacy and influence, Ron Asheton never needed the spotlight. He didn't care about magazine covers, didn't fight for center stage, and never tried to define himself through fame. All he ever needed for his entire life was a guitar, an amp, and a sound loud enough to scream the things words could never quite say. And that sound, raw, repetitive, like an instinctive shiver, became the original language of punk rock. Not music meant to be sung along to, music meant to be lived with, to crash into, to claw out the wordless emotions buried in the chest. From I Wanna Be Your Dog with its revolutionary 3-note riff to TVI and No Fun, the songs built around Ron Asheton's guitar became the sacred text of punk, covered by hundreds of bands, quoted in films, video games, fashion, and regarded as the primal DNA of the entire 1970s to 80s counterculture. His influence spread far beyond any chart or critics list. Kurt Cobain called the Stooges the starting point for all the music I believe in. Johnny Ramone admitted he learned how to play tight, brutal rhythm guitar from Asheton. Josh Homme of Queens of the Stone Age once said, "Ron played guitar like he was controlling a slow-motion explosion." From Sonic Youth to Jack White, from Mudhoney to Ty Segall, Ron's music echoed in every corner punk ever reached, even if the name Asheton was sometimes left unspoken. But maybe that very silence was part of his deepest message. Ron never tried to be a hero. He never spoke like a symbol. He never sold himself to the moment. But by staying absolutely true to his art, From 1969 until his death, he showed the world that loyalty to your identity is a kind of invincible power. And though he wasn't the most famous member of the Stooges, wasn't the one center stage, wasn't the one holding the mic, anyone who ever truly listened knew if Iggy Pop was the scream, then Ron Asheton was the heartbeat behind it. A heartbeat that never had to shout, because every pulse shook an entire generation. Ron Asheton was never the kind of artist the world typically celebrates. He didn't follow the star template. He didn't deliver grand speeches. He never tried to outrun time. And because of that, he became a different kind of icon, a living proof that you don't need attention to leave a deep, lasting impact. He lived almost his entire life in quiet, quietly creating, quietly pushed aside, quietly reborn, and quietly gone. But since his death, the quiet has begun to roar. A new generation of musicians continues to find pieces of themselves in his riffs. Young listeners, hearing I Want to Be Your Dog for the first time, still feel cornered, pulled into something primal. Not just music, but the survival instinct of someone who refused to be molded. Ron Asheton didn't need to say much. He let the guitar speak, and it spoke too well. It made the whole world hear the cry of a soul that would not be silenced. Maybe you'd never heard the name Ron Asheton. Maybe you only ever saw Iggy Pop and thought that was the whole story. But if you've ever stood in a dark room hearing a guitar scream like it was ripping out of someone's chest, then you've heard Ron, even if you didn't know it. If you believe this story deserves to be remembered as a piece of history that was never fully told, like the video, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts below. Have you ever heard a song that made your heart race? Not because of the melody, but because it said what you never could. If so, maybe you understand Ron Asheton better than anyone who ever wrote about him.